Well, this raises the exciting prospect that we could actually revitalize our former mining towns and turn them into centres of geothermal power production.
Here's the vision. Down at Hill, former mining towns in Cornwall and the north becoming gleaming hubs of geothermal energy. Cloth-capped men proudly trooping in each morning to pour water down the well.
The bucket lines of the future.
Georgian townhouses on the moon, the highest GDP per capita in the Milky Way.
Small modular reactors under every village green.
This is Anglo-futurism.
Welcome back. You are listening to another broadcast from the King Charles III Space Station. I'm Callum Drysdale.
And I'm Tom O. And I'm always banging on about geothermal power, aren't I, Callum?
Indeed you are. In fact, it's one of your core obsessions.
It certainly is. Geothermal rocks. Listeners will explain it in a second, but know for the time being that geothermal is as exciting a human endeavour by my lights as sewage is by Callum's.
Must be pretty exciting then. And I note that both fields concern the steaming bounties that lurk beneath our feet.
Callum, I'm going to stop you there because I can see that our next guest's diamond-tipped spacecraft is docking with the King Charles.
I do hope the diamond won't scratch our airlock. I knew we shouldn't have used Cotswold stone, but here he is, John Clegg.
John and I first spoke earlier this year when I was writing a think tank report about the US government's geothermal policy. John is President and Chief Technology Officer at Hepha Energy Technology, and he enthralled me with his vision of space-age technology unleashing geothermal power across the globe, revitalising British mining towns along the way.
John, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
Let's drill down into it.
John, let's imagine for a moment that we're not aboard a space station and that instead we're sitting in a podcast studio in southeast England. What is actually going on beneath our feet?
Okay, that's a bit of a stretch, but let's imagine we are. And right underneath us, we've obviously got the building's foundations, hopefully some concrete and rebar. And given where we are in the southeast of England...
Allegedly,
yeah. Probably clay or something like that underneath us. I'm not a geologist, so I'm not going to talk you through the rest of the structure. But as we go down, the rocks gradually get hotter, and eventually we get to the core of the Earth, of course, which is boiling away at somewhere between 4,000 and 6,000 degrees Celsius.
And this is quite hot. And I mean, in our hypothetical scenario, the heat doesn't feel too hot on the bottom of my feet. How does this heat actually escape?
Well, luckily for us, the continental crust that we're sat on has a very low sort of thermal conductivity. Otherwise, we'd all burn our feet when we went outside. There is some that comes up through the Earth where we are, but it's a tiny fraction of the energy we get from the sun. You get a bit more escaping through the thinner crust under the oceans, but a lot of it comes out through continental plate tectonics. We get magma build up in the subsea. And of course, some of it comes out spectacularly through volcanoes.
But actually, a lot of this power, or a lot of this heat actually just stays internally?
It's continually being generated, so there's a constant flow. Otherwise, the Earth would get hotter and hotter, so it kind of balances. But there is a lot of heat energy down there.
And it's essentially a nuclear reactor, right? It's not just encased heat from the Earth's creation.
Most of it is, There is surprisingly still a little bit of encased heat from like planetary accretion when all the parts of the Earth came together, even after like 4.5 billion years or whatever. But most of it comes from radioactive decay. So it's like a sort of natural nuclear reactor where the radioactive waste remains buried very, very deep underground.
As you've suggested, John, this superheated core stays on overnight, doesn't it? So it makes a pleasant change from the more intermittent forms of other renewable energies.
Absolutely right. And it doesn't just stay on overnight. It's also, once you get more than a few meters below the surface, it's independent of weather. So it's like a resource which is available, 24/7, 365. It's always there if we're able to go and exploit it.
Which seems to make it an ideal form of power. To what extent has humanity harnessed this in the past?
Well, it isn't an ideal form of power, and I'll maybe spend a couple of minutes explaining just what's so good about it. I mean, it's always available, like you said, but also it's very dispatchable. And dispatchable means that if you have a geothermal power station, you can turn the power from it on and off very quickly. And that's very important for balancing an electric grid and electric power supply system. And at the moment, the only technology we've really got which is capable of doing that is continuing to burn natural gas. It might be possible to get there with intermittent renewables like wind and solar and batteries, but that's a hell of a lot of lithium batteries. And with geothermal, you can do it without investing in all of those batteries and have a source of power that can actually replace and phase out natural gas for electricity generation.
And I assume you're not saying that we turn the earth off. We just stop sending water down the well.
You actually choke the water that's coming back up from the well. So in some variations of geothermal, you'll have naturally occurring water which is flowing up, maybe pumped or maybe forced by injection of cold fluids. In other forms of geothermal, unconventional geothermal, as we talk about it, we can drill wells and create artificial reservoirs and pump our own cold fluids into the rock and get hot fluids back. And the easiest way to turn it up and down instantaneously is just to throttle the amount of fluid that's coming out of the earth. And the great thing is that if you do throttle it down, the stuff that stays in there just gets a bit hotter, so you don't lose the energy.
Right, so you can then just get even more and make up the difference later on.
Yeah.
But humanity doesn't seem to have harnessed this as much as we have the wind and the sun. How are humans extracting power from this hot earth?
We've been doing it for a while, and I live in Cheltenham, and not too far from where I live is Bath Spa, which was the Roman spa. And 2,000 years ago, the Romans were using hot geothermal waters to create sort of baths that they were able to use then and remain open to the present day. So,
Quite dirty water, though, from what I've seen.
Yeah, true, but I guess it's whatever you compare it with at the time. But we have been using geothermal in this country for a couple of thousand years. More recently, people have been using it for heating, and it's a tremendous source of relatively low cost and very green heat. I mean, we should, my business isn't looking at heating buildings, but we should all be thinking about heating buildings using geothermal energy rather than burning natural gas, and cooling them as well, by the way, because we can get to the point where the fluid we get from below the earth is, if it's shallow enough, it's cooler than the temperature is. Like, today's a very hot day in London before I came up to the spaceship, and we can replace our air conditioning with some geothermal cooling as well. But in terms of electricity generation, which is really where my interest is, about 100 years ago in Larderello in Italy, the first geothermal power plant for electricity was created. It still exists there today in Tuscany. And since then, it's been replicated in places around the world, but always places that tend to be associated with volcanic activity: Iceland, New Zealand, California, Italy, Turkey, Indonesia, kinds of places where you'd expect there to be heat. I was
going to say that actually it's not something that we've seen deployed as widely as solar. I imagine that's because we're quite constrained by the geology about where you can actually put these wells.
Yes, but this is where the difference between conventional or hydrothermal geothermal wells and unconventional wells comes into play. Looking back in history, and indeed when I started looking at geothermal, I was kind of skeptical because I thought, well, yeah, Iceland, New Zealand, but it's not broadly applicable. In those places, you have a combination of heat close to the surface and naturally fractured rocks and a supply of water. Maybe it's rainwater that slowly filters down through the rocks, gets heated up. You can drill a hole, you can get hot water and steam.
And the water just kind of comes bursting back out again.
So if it's under pressure, after a time, you maybe need to inject water into the reservoir to replenish it and keep it going. It depends how much natural replenishment there is. More recently, a number of companies around the world have been developing what we've called unconventional geothermal technology, which borrows a lot from unconventional oil and gas technology, and we can talk about that later if you like. But that would allow you to drill a geothermal well anywhere in the world because you're no longer drilling for fluid. All we're drilling for with unconventional geothermal is heat, and we provide our own fluid. So anywhere it's hot underground, which is everywhere in the world, is a candidate for unconventional geothermal.
Now, John, let's talk a little bit about these newer forms of geothermal, and perhaps we can explain it to listeners so they understand mechanically what's going on.
Yeah, sure. There are a few different ways of doing it. Like with any new technology, you have a few different competing techniques or products or whatever. And over the course of time, that might shake down and you might see some of them be more successful than others. But generally speaking, they will all drill at least one well and create a system whereby you can pump cold fluid in and get hot fluid back. And in fact, you may not need to do that much pumping because you get a kind of thermosiphon effect. As the fluid goes down, it heats up. then it's less dense and then it will naturally want to rise to the surface. And if you want to visualize it, there's maybe 3 different ways of doing it. The first one is to drill a single well. And once you've drilled it, to run a piece of insulated pipe all the way to the bottom of the well, to pump cold fluid down the outside of that insulated pipe so it heats up on the way down, and then to have the hot fluid come back up the center. And if the insulation is good enough, it'll still be hot when it gets back to the surface. And you can use that to generate power. The second one is to imagine drilling a pair of wells and then connecting them at the end. And these wells might be, sort of between 5 and 10 kilometers deep. And they might also extend horizontally for a few kilometers as well. So there'd be very long wells.
And this is obviously something that the oil and gas industry has a lot of experience with, right? That actually a lot of these skills and expertise in drilling is quite transferable.
Yeah, the oil and gas industry spent maybe 100 years figuring out how to drill directional wells. Some of the first directional wells were drilled about 100 years ago off places like Huntington Beach in California, where they actually had rigs right on the beach by the shoreline, exploiting resources that were just offshore. And so they weren't spectacular directional wells by modern standards, but the history is about 100 years ago. And so it's taken about 100 years for the industry to figure out how to drill the wells it does today. But today, drilling long, deep wells and making them intersect at the end is something that's well within the industry's wheelhouse, albeit only at temperatures up to about 175 degrees Celsius.
Surely you're not suggesting that the drill goes down and then when it gets deep enough, takes a right angle turn and then starts drilling sideways.
That's exactly what we do. That's exactly what is done in most of the oil and gas wells that are drilled in the United States now. That you go down to a certain depth, and horizontal drilling was pioneered and perfected in oil and gas because you're going after reservoirs which are in relatively thin bands, and they start off horizontal. They might not finish up being horizontal because of folding and stuff like that, but they're often close to horizontal. And so you drill down to where the reservoir is, you turn the well through 90 degrees, and then you drill along the reservoir to maximize the amount of fluid that you get from it. And there's potentially an analog in geothermal because isotherms, or lines of constant temperature, they're also not quite horizontal, but they're pretty close. And so what you might want to do is to drill down to a desired production temperature, then turn through 90 degrees, and then drill horizontally along that production temperature for as far as you can.
But most geothermal power plants that are in this modern generation, in fact, use a form of geothermal called enhanced geothermal, right? So it's based on fracking rather than using directional drilling.
There are a couple of different competing technologies, if you like. One of them is called advanced geothermal, where you just drill a well and you expose the fluid to the formation, basically the outside diameter of the well. And there is also a technique where you might drill 2 or possibly more parallel wells, probably horizontal wells, and then create artificial fractures between them.
And so that's, as like Tom said, fracking, you're basically forcing high-pressured liquid down the well to create artificial cracks that water can then seep through.
Yeah, fracturing it, hence fracking.
Yeah, that's right. And just doing so in a targeted way so that you get communication between the 2 wells, but nothing else.
And if you get a few rumbles up top, then so be it.
Hopefully you don't. I mean, there have been some...
China's shaking in the King Charles.
That's right. There's been a few unfortunate experiences with some of the early attempts at it. But I think the process is now very well understood, and it doesn't require the energy that it would take to cause earthquakes that you'd be worried about and stuff like that. It is a hurdle that the industry has to get over because of there's a negative image associated with it. But it's unlikely to cause any problems to any of us on the surface.
We want good vibrations.
No, exactly. Well, it does. It does seem to rouse the most ardent opposition. People who are, don't like the idea of
Well, NIMBYs hate it when their houses rattle. It's so unreasonable.
It might lower the house prices.
when portraits falling from the walls.
I think maybe we need a different word.
Okay, let's call them good vibrations from now on.
Like that.
And it seems like an interesting time for geothermal generally. On the one hand, humanity has been so stupid as to ignore the open goal that is harnessing this form of clean energy. On the other, because of the rise of fracking over the past few decades, it would seem to me that there would be quite a lot of oven-ready technology, as it were, ready to be transferred to this new and promising industry.
Yeah, as controversial as exploiting unconventional oil and gas reserves, which has mainly been in the United States, has been.
You mean fracking by that? Sorry. The creation of good vibrations.
Horizontal drilling combined with the creation of good vibrations.
Yes, okay.
As controversial as that might have been, it has allowed the development and refinement of technologies that will pave the way for us to be able to drill very effective geothermal wells. It's basically transferring those technologies from an industry that's brought the cost of them down by a factor of about 3 over the last 15 years into an industry that's ready to receive them. With the one caveat that the oil and gas wells tend not to be drilled above somewhere between 175 and 200 degrees Celsius, whereas with geothermal wells, we want to go a lot deeper and a lot hotter.
Well, this was going to be my question, because actually, what kind of energy density can you get from this water? How hot do you need the rock to be in order to produce any kind of meaningful power beyond just sort of warm water for your bath?
So the first company to successfully drill an EGS pair of wells was a company called Fervo, and they did this last year in Nevada in the US.
And these are the 2 wells that are nearby, and then
with fractures between them.
Yeah.
And they were, I think their reservoir temperature was around 190 degrees Celsius, and they were able to produce about 3.5 megawatts of power. It's a reasonable amount of power from a well.
I have just consulted the King Charles's onboard computer, and it informs us that a 3 megawatt power capacity refers to the output capability that can supply electricity to about 1,000 average US homes or about 2,000 average UK homes.
A trifling amount, and that frankly we should be scoffing at. John, I assume you're going to tell us that there are far more sexy and attractive offerings out there.
Firstly, you can drill more than one well, maybe, but also there is tremendous leverage from going deeper. We've done a lot of modeling on the impact of higher temperature reservoirs, and you won't be surprised to hear that if you increase the temperature of the reservoir that you try and exploit, artificial reservoir as it might be, you significantly increase the amount of power generation that you get. We've modeled comparing sub 200 degrees Celsius reservoir temperatures with 250 degrees C. You get about a 45% reduction in the cost of electricity. You get up to 370 degrees C, it's about a 67% reduction in the cost. And so if you want, you can invert that and say you get 3 times as much power roughly. So tremendous amount of leverage that comes from being able to drill at higher temperatures, which is definitely where the industry is going. If you talk to any of the players who are drilling unconventional geothermal wells at the moment, many of them publicly, some of them maybe privately, will tell you that they're looking to get to higher and higher temperatures.
You just drill deeper, you go further and further, it's hotter and hotter, and then the water's coming up is just so much hotter, so you can extract more energy from it.
Correct, yeah. I mean, you've got to take care of that water as it comes up, because you've got to try and keep it hot on its journey from deep down in the earth. It's going to come up adjacent to things like aquifers when it gets close to the surface, which will try and rob it of all its heat. So you have to have good insulation in the piping that you have, but you also have to keep it distinct from the aquifers anyway, because you don't want to cause any damage to them. So
right, you sort of shepherd this water heat up. Okay,
yeah.
But even getting down that deep is quite problematic.
In terms of vertical depth, you'll come up against problems like potentially pressure, hydrostatic pressure. You also, it tends to get hotter down there. And so you will come up against limitations in terms of how much temperature your drilling and completion equipment can survive.
John, what actually is happening down these holes? What does the environment look like? I mean, imagine at some point the rock will actually melt, right? What are we aiming for down there?
Well, yeah, molten rock is definitely what the guys we talked about earlier in Iceland are after when they're trying to drill into magma. But there's not many places where magma is that close to the surface, maybe fortunately, but it's maybe a little bit contested. I've talked to people who hold different opinions about what kind of happens to the rock when it gets under extremes of temperature and pressure. Most materials, when you subject them to these extremes, real extremes of temperature and pressure, they kind of go squishy, regardless of what they are. I'm not sure whether or not that's really going to happen to rock at the temperatures we're talking about, whether there's going to be any kind of ductility or plasticity that's going to affect the behavior of a reservoir. But there is a big price to going to higher temperatures. A sweet spot seems to be getting to somewhere between 300 and 400 Celsius for these wells. And there is a critical number in there, and I think it's 373 degrees Celsius or thereabouts is the point at which water becomes supercritical. And then it's no longer like water or steam. It's kind of some strange mixture of the two, which has the capability to hold a lot of energy. And that can be extremely valuable in terms of increasing the amount of power you can get from the plant on the surface.
Right. So it's the energy density of this supercritical liquid is far higher.
Yeah.
Right. Okay. And so we can extract a lot more energy.
I think now would be a good time to invoke one of my favorite topics, which is the Kola Super Deep Borehole. Well, I know Callum needs no introduction to this because I'm always boring him about it, as it were. But the Kola Super Deep Borehole was dug by the Soviet Union as an experiment from the 70s or the 80s. And it took them 20 years and they got 12 kilometers deep, which I believe makes it the deepest vertical hole in the world. But they ran out of problems, didn't they, John?
Well, first of all, you need to get out more, I think.
Oh.
If that's your favorite.
No. I'm very happy on the Wikipedia page, the Kola Super Deep Borehole.
Yeah, and drilling wells that deep is not alien to the oil and gas industry now. About 30 years ago, in fact, I was working on a project in Dorset where we drilled holes that were about 12 kilometers long. They didn't go down vertically 12 kilometers. They actually did something a bit more difficult, which is go down maybe 1.5 or 2 kilometers and then turn through 90 degrees and went 10 kilometers out under Poole Bay in the English Channel.
Wait, sorry, you're saying that there is more exciting stuff going on drilling-wise in Dorset than on the whole of the Kola Peninsula in the Soviet Union in the 1980s?
I have always known that Dorset was more of the technological hub than the Soviet Union.
It was the place to be.
Oh my God, I need to find a new Wikipedia page.
Sorry, John, I really have to understand this. How does the drill bit just turn sideways? Does it get down and then turn itself around? And what does this actually look like?
Well, this is one of those things that's taken 100 years to develop, and there are different technologies for doing it. But for drilling deep, long horizontal sections, the best technology to use is probably a rotary steerable system. And that includes a tool which sits immediately behind the bit, maybe sort of a half a meter behind the bit. There will be a number of pistons or pads that can move out under control, and it's computer controlled. It's a bit like a little downhole robot. And as the bit rotates, at the right moment, one of these pistons will move out on the opposite side of the direction you want to drill in and just nudge the bit sideways. And over the course of time, that allows you to make a turn. So these turns we're talking about to get from vertical to horizontal, it's not an immediate right-hand turn, but it'll happen with maybe a radius of about 150 meters, radius of curvature.
What a time to be alive! But
it's about the same turning circle, Tom, as your VW Beetle.
That's from 1973. Yeah, alas. But John, I do want to return to the matter of the Kola Super Deep Borehole, because as any scholar of deep drilling will tell you, the Soviets ran into these problems, and it becomes quite tricky, doesn't it, to drill when you get to those deep vertical depths. So what's going on? Like, why can't we drill even deeper holes than our beloved Kola Super Deep Borehole?
There's a number of challenges with drilling deep. I mean, first of all, the formation gets more difficult to drill. It gets harder. It tends to have basement rocks tend to have higher coefficient of friction than sedimentary rocks. And that can cause more problems with shock and vibration while you're drilling, which is a major problem that you have to contend with designing downhole equipment. Bad vibrations, absolutely, yeah. In order to mitigate against that, you need to drill the well as straight as you possibly can. If you don't drill the well straight, if it has lots and lots of little sort of micro changes in direction, the oil and gas industry actually calls them dog legs because they're not straight. Lots of micro dog legs cause more and more friction. Eventually, it becomes impossible to push the pipe into the well or pull it out of the well. In addition, as you get deeper, you get higher and higher hydrostatic pressures. And that can cause issues with equipment and can also potentially cause issues with drilling. It changes the way that the rock behaves as you cut it. And you can get into much higher temperatures. And temperature is one of the challenges that the industry has to overcome. That when you look at the likely profile of geothermal wells, they're probably going to have higher temperature but lower pressure than some of the deepest and most challenging oil and gas wells. So pressure is kind of nailed. It's temperature that we really have to work on.
Right. So the drill is now at such a depth and such a temperature that actually its parts are sort of melting as it goes?
Yeah, not quite the drill melting. I mean, the drill bits that are used will, the diamond tip cutters in the drill bits, they will work up to, 700-800 degrees Celsius. But the key part is if you have any elastomers in the tool, like seals, then it's difficult to get dynamic seals to work at or above 200 Celsius.
And these are things preventing water and grit and things getting into the parts.
Yeah, that's right. And so you really need to have metal seals, but also electronic components. The commercial electronic components that typically people buy off the shelf, they could be limited to anywhere from 85 to maybe 150 degrees Celsius. The industry, oil and gas industries, found ways of pushing those over the years, but it kind of ran up against a bit of a wall. Back in the 1970s, I think the first measurement while drilling tool, the first tool that will actually have electronics downhole to measure the direction of the well and send information back in real time, that came out with a temperature capability of 85 degrees Celsius. By the mid-1990s, it was up to 175 degrees Celsius. And in the intervening 25 years since then, we really haven't got much further. And so using commercially available electronics, it's difficult to get beyond that 200 Celsius barrier. And it's critically important for us to do that if we're going to be able to enable this industry to get really deep and to get really effective and economic wells.
And these are just because the silicon and the
the physics stops working in the silicon. Transistors don't really know whether they're switched on or switched off anymore. The plastic packaging used on all these components might literally melt at that point. And so you've got physics problems and engineering problems at that point.
And John, I imagine, may potentially even equal or even harder than the challenges found kilometers beneath the Earth are the problems found on the first and second stories of government buildings. What are the regulatory obstacles that are preventing these drills from pocking our landscape with supercharged geysers?
In what way is the government preventing us from enjoying the spectacle of incredibly deep holes pot-marking Britain's landscape?
That's a great question, and that's got a lot of answers. But I think one of them is just acknowledgement and awareness. The UK in particular has embarked on a campaign of looking at offshore wind, for example, to provide a lot of our energy. And, in principle, it's not a bad idea because offshore wind is a lot more reliable than onshore wind. It's kind of in the wrong place because you're generating the electricity far offshore and you're going to be using it onshore. So there's a lot of transmission issues that you have to overcome. But on the flight up here, I downloaded the UK's energy security sort of policy that was published, I think, October of 2023. And I looked through it, and hydrogen's mentioned 112 times, wind 69 times, solar 44 times, nuclear 46 times. Believe it or not, if you search on coal gets 4 mentions in there. Geothermal, it's 1. It's mentioned once, kind of in passing. And so there's not really a lot of either awareness or interest. I'd like to believe it's the former rather than the latter, which is, one of the reasons I'm happy to talk to you guys today, because, people might listen to this and people might hear it and people might think, oh, geothermal. So awareness is a big part of it.
And this lack of awareness actually translates to quite severe bureaucratic hurdles. I visited last summer, maybe a couple of summers ago, the Eden Project geothermal well, which as of quite recently has started producing heat for the Eden Project in Cornwall. And the CEO told me that one of the big problems they were having, because there is no specific geothermal regulation, they were having to wholesale import oil and gas regulation. And that meant that they had to have this crazy, huge contraption at the top of their well at all times called a blowout preventer. And a blowout preventer costs 25k a day to hire. And the whole point of it is to, I suppose, shield the power plant from oil and gas explosions. But there was no oil and gas down that hole. So it was 25 grand a day that they were spending on satisfying this needless bureaucracy. Is this kind of roughly how it works?
Yeah, I mean, a blowout preventer is essential when you're drilling an oil and gas well, because what you don't want is uncontrolled escape of either oil or gas from the well. I mean, we saw it happen with Macondo in the Gulf of Mexico back in, I think it was 2011. And it's pretty nasty when you lose control of it. When you're drilling for geothermal wells, I mean, you have to know that there's no oil or gas down there. But provided that you do, then, maybe you don't need quite the same regulations. And I think because it's a kind of an infant industry, it's still trying to find its way in terms of regulation. And I guess it's logical to err on the side of safety, but that probably brings some cost with it. Another thing which, depending on where you are in the world, is potentially an issue is understanding who actually owns the heat. Is it a resource that could be mined? Is it a natural property of the rock? Who does it actually belong to? And in different countries, some countries, if you've got resources underground, they're the property of the landowner. In the UK, if you've got resources like oil or gas underground, they're property of the Crown and you have to take a license. So understanding, it's not an issue that's confined to the UK, but understanding who actually owns the heat, I think would be a a big risk removal sort of step forward for people who are looking to invest in geothermal.
Because at the moment, it just seems too complicated to even dip your toe in, so to speak.
I think there's still a lack of clarity, yeah. And there's been, I couldn't give you the exact example, but I know there's been building construction has been challenged recently on the grounds of whether you have permits to excavate and remove soil, for example. So those kind of hurdles we need to make sure we don't unnecessarily put in the way of geothermal energy. We need to have sensible planning and regulation, but we need to make sure it's fit for purpose.
This does raise the question, John, does this heat run out? Can you exhaust the heat in a local area and make this sort of geothermally dead, so to speak?
I guess the answer to that is yes and no. And the short answer is no. I mean, there's a very, very big supply of geothermal energy underneath us. The geothermal energy under the UK is estimated to be equivalent to the energy that we were producing from the North Sea in terms of oil and gas in its heyday.
As in every day, we could be generating that power just constantly.
Yeah, in theory, if we took it to its extreme, it'll take
if
some time
every
to get
back
there.
garden had their own well.
Almost, yeah. The long answer is you have to be careful about how you design the installation, and particularly if you have what we call an AGS well, where you just drill a well, which is where its outside diameter is in contact with the formation. As heat flows towards the well, you take heat away from the well with fluid, and then it has to be replenished. And as heat flows towards the well, the closer it gets to the well, the smaller the cross-sectional area it has to flow through. So the circular segments immediately around the well act a little bit like a thermal choke. And so they manage the rate at which the well will recover its temperature. And if you're smart about the way that you design your wells and the way that you design your project, it's a problem you can overcome. But you have to bear it in mind when you start. It's because of the reason we were talking about earlier on in the podcast that we don't burn our feet when we walk outside. The thermal conductivity of rock is quite low. Different kinds of rock have different thermal conductivities, but they're either bad or really bad. So you have to take account of it when you design it. But it is not an impediment to producing energy economically from the earth.
So feasibly, this is an unlimited source of power sitting beneath our feet.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, it's probably going to last for a lot longer than we do. I mean, it's going to be there for billions of years. And those nuclear reactions that are taking place, the radioactive decay that's taking place, will continue to take place for some considerable time. And that heat flow will continue to come up from the center of the earth.
John, are there any other obstacles that are preventing us from enjoying the fruits of geothermal in Britain?
Potentially, yeah. I mean, permitting is an issue, and we need a sort of planning regime whereby it's possible to get permits to drill geothermal wells without spending many years going through the process. And also, although geothermal itself mitigates against this problem to an extent, access to the grid is a problem in places around the world with any new form of electricity supply. I think in California, for example, one of the biggest problems at the moment facing the geothermal industry there is actually getting interconnect to the grid. Geothermal has a solution to that because you can drill the wells anywhere. If you imagine you were designing a new housing development or a new industrial park, you could actually drill the geothermal well adjacent to where the power is going to be used and then use private wires. So rather than connecting to the national grid, you could use your own wire either to connect directly from the power station to the point of use, or you could build your own wire, maybe to connect into the grid. So allowing the use of private wires and enabling permits to interconnect more quickly, I think would be quite a big boost.
That seems astonishing that it could just be dug under residential areas and there's no worry about safety or what the fracking lunatics, the fracking opponents would tell us, that it will shake and rattle and knock everything off its place.
It has a tremendously small footprint. And when it's done, you finish up with a relatively small, low-rise plant, which doesn't really have any emissions. The only thing you might see is steam, or you might produce some water. So it
but which wouldn't be radioactive, or anything.
We don't go anything like that deep to get the water radioactive, no. So
sounds pretty ideal.
Brilliant. Well, John, we are going to ask you about your vision for how Britain can, in this way, pioneer the next generation of geothermal power. But for now, let's go to a break.
Oh, look, the postman's been. And there's something here for you, Tom.
Ooh, another gifted goodie from the British High Commission on New Poundsbury.
Open it up. Let's see what it is.
It's a 260 to 300 rail card. British longevity research has really come on, and it's enabling us to live for centuries.
Still not long enough to watch a game of space test cricket, though. But tell me more about the rail card.
Well, it says here that it entitles the bearer to limitless travel on high-speed interplanetary railway systems. So we can now visit the great British gold mines in the asteroid belt, go skiing on Ganymede, and speed past the French colony on Uranus.
Perfect for any spring chickens who have just finished their exams and are looking forward to interrailing over the summer. Welcome back, listeners. We've now got to the part of the show that I know you've all been dying for, which is how Britain can take advantage of this unlimited natural resource. John, I imagine you're going to tell us that Britain had a glorious past in this, but has since let its expertise die away.
I'm not sure that Britain ever had a glorious past in geothermal, but yeah.
What about there was a plant in the 80s in Southampton, right? And then it kind of rattled a few cages and people got spooked.
Yeah, I'm not sure that one plant in the 80s is really a glorious past. But
a promising dawn.
A precocious teenage attempt.
Yeah, I certainly don't want to knock what was done in Southampton because it was visionary, but it didn't really get followed up. I mean, the country didn't really sort of grasp that nettle and continue to develop it. I think there is an opportunity here for the UK simply because, whether you realize it or not, a lot of the technology used to drill and complete and produce from oil and gas wells around the world is developed in the UK and is still exported from the UK. And that is a resource that is going to dwindle away over the next decade or so as we significantly reduce the emphasis on oil and gas exploration in the UK sector of the North Sea. And obviously it's already stopped onshore in the UK. And we have the opportunity to take that resource and redeploy it. And, you know, all those same skills can be deployed in terms of geothermal rather than in terms of oil and gas. And that means we don't just have an opportunity to provide power in the UK, clean power in the UK. We also have a big export opportunity to help other countries around the world to do this. One of the things that's really special for me about geothermal energy is that, you know, if you work in oil and gas, then there are certain places in the world where there are reservoirs that are productive, and sometimes you're lucky if you're born in one of those countries or if you happen to inherit the oil fields in one of those countries. And sometimes you're not if you don't happen to have oil and gas under your feet. Everybody's got heat underneath them. So it's an opportunity for every country in the world to potentially become energy independent. With energy comes the ability to solve pretty much every other problem. You can solve healthcare, you can solve food, you can solve housing if you've got enough energy. And so if you have a plentiful supply of energy, then each country becomes a lot more self-sufficient. And that's potentially a very good way of avoiding or preventing future conflict.
So it's fantastic for everyone. Britain has some expertise from our oil and gas industry, but I think a crucial additional point is that we have some expertise in solving the technical problems that are preventing humanity from accessing the full power of geothermal. And you are one of these people, aren't you, with your company, Hepha?
Yeah, that's right. There are a few countries around the world where a lot of development of oil and gas drilling and completion technology has been done. The UK is definitely one of them. And yeah, Hepha, my company, it's kind of jointly housed in the UK, the US, and Spain, each country for a slightly different reason. But certainly the UK and the US both have a lot of heritage. And, you know, if you're surprised to find that the UK has a lot of heritage in oil and gas drilling, for example, it's partly because of the North Sea, but it's also partly because a lot of the technologies that are used in oil and gas come from aerospace. Avionics kind of leads into downhole electronics and sensors, materials for very extreme environments, high temperatures, high pressures. You think about gas turbine engines, for example, very, very difficult materials challenges there. And UK has historically had a very strong aerospace industry. And a lot of that skill has migrated into oil and gas and can then make another jump into geothermal.
The question I have is, are the other large oil and gas companies wising up to this fact? Are they noticing that actually they've got the skills that they can be redeployed, or are you ahead of the curve?
The answer is yes to both, really. I think they do understand that geothermal is an opportunity. There was a webinar that was run recently by SLB, formerly Schlumberger, which is one of the big oil and gas service companies, and a company called Hepha, Canadian company that's drilling a big geothermal project in Bavaria. And we heard a couple of things on that podcast that were very interesting. One of them is the Ever representative confirming that they want to drill between 300 and 400 degrees Celsius. And then the Schlumberger guy saying that, in his opinion, it won't be long before geothermal is a bigger drilling industry than oil and gas, which was surprising to hear. I actually had to speak to him afterward and say, did you really say that? And he said, yeah.
Well, there's a Schlumberger guy who's running this company, Quays, isn't there, which promises to essentially use lasers to go 20 kilometers deep and access that kind of heat.
Yeah, I think they're using millimeter wave and a waveguide. And there's a couple of companies. There's another company called GA, which came out of Eastern Europe, but is now officially headquartered in the US, that is trying to use plasma to do the same thing and to drill these really, really ultra deep wells. And those technologies may well have their place in the future. In the medium term, the kinds of technologies we've used to drill oil and gas wells will serve their purpose, and they've been refined and drilling much, much quicker than they were even a few years ago. Yeah, the pace of learning in terms of how to drill these basement rocks is remarkable. But yeah, there's definitely much more cutting edge, if you pardon the pun, technology that's coming along down the track.
Well, including the stuff you're working on, right?
Yeah, I mean, our mission is to take the sensors and the electronics that I talked about before and make them work at higher temperatures. We'll be releasing our first products at the beginning of next year, which will be capable of operating at 210 degrees Celsius, which is a big step forward. And by 2030, we've got a technology roadmap that takes us all the way up to 300 degrees Celsius. And I think you asked about, do you have a lead, a head start, if you like? And I think we do, simply because it's been our only focus. We're not distracted by day-to-day business in other industries. And we don't have any business at lower temperatures, so we absolutely have to make the high temperature stuff work. And so we've been busy working the last 2 or 3 years on IP and then on proving the physics part of it. So there are two problems to solve. One of them is physics and one of them is engineering. And the first question is, can you actually get electronics to work up to 300 degrees Celsius? And I think we now know that we can. And then now it's just engineering it. It's packaging and putting things together and making sure that things will survive for a long time at that temperature. And getting electronics to work at that temperature, it's partly working on higher temperature capability in the electronics, but it's also working on protecting the stuff from itself and getting the heat away from it as fast as possible. If you hold your cell phone to your ear on a long call, or if you use your laptop for an extended period of time, you'll notice they can get very hot. And so the processors and the other components that you use are very capable of producing heat by themselves. And so you don't just have to protect them from the external environment, you also have to get that heat away as quickly as possible. And one of the reasons we opened an office in Spain is because, despite everything I said about skill, we wanted to solve problems that had never been solved before. And, part of my experience is that if you want to do things that are impossible, get people who don't know that they're impossible. And if they don't know they're impossible, they'll find ways to do it. If somebody knows because of their 20 or 30 years of experience that something can't be done, it doesn't matter how hard they try, they can't get over that hump and they can't do it. And so we are doing some engineering in places where traditionally oil and gas has been strong, because we can leverage skills, supply chain, manufacturing in those places. And we're doing some of it in places where it's a completely new thing, because there we come up with some crazy radical ideas that actually appear to work.
Can you give us an idea of what the secret sauce is? Like, how are you creating electronics that don't melt or go wrong when they're at these very high temperatures? Like, what is the special thing that you are doing that others are not?
It's a multi-stage process. And for 210 degrees Celsius, we can actually get a lot of the stuff that we need. There is actually a lot of electronics which manufacturers are now rating at 210 Celsius. And I think a lot of that's driven by demands from the aerospace industry. Gas turbine engine manufacturers want to get components closer and sensors closer to the combustion chamber in an engine to get better feedback on what's going on and improve fuel efficiency. Unfortunately, things like hypersonic missiles are a much bigger thing than they were a few years ago. So stuff in there gets very, very hot. And so there is fallout from aerospace that's allowing components to become available. If components are commercially available but don't work at those temperatures, it's possible to repackage them. And there are a few companies around that will do that for you. Literally take the insides out of an electronic chip and put it in a new package. And that can allow you to get some remarkable improvements. As we get closer to 300 degrees Celsius, though, silicon-based components aren't going to work anymore. But there are technologies, including silicon carbide and fully depleted silicon oxide substrates that will work and appear to work reliably up to at least 300 degrees Celsius. And so part of the battle is putting the die, if you like, the heart of the component on that substrate. Another part of it is then building packaging around it that's not going to melt like the plastic packaging on commercial components does. And we've identified partners who we can work with to take us at least to 300 Celsius, potentially beyond.
Something that I'm interested in is, because you mentioned that we could have these wells in residential areas, but that also deeper is better. And I imagine it becomes more and more expensive as you go deeper. Would it make more sense to have fewer, deeper, larger wells, or at a greater number of shallower ones?
There's a model called GTEM, which stands for something like Geothermal Energy Economics Evaluation Model. That's not what it is, but it published by the US DOE. I think it was originally published in 2016. It's publicly available. It's open source. You can go and you can download the file.
With pleasure.
Yeah, go and play with it. And if you model that, it takes into account the cost of drilling deeper wells, but it also takes into account the additional energy that you get from hotter wells. And we use that as the basis of our modeling to show that pretty much regardless of the boundary conditions and the assumptions that you make, if you go deeper and get higher temperature, you get much better economics. So yeah, deeper and hotter wells would definitely be economically superior for power to shallower and cooler wells.
Well, this raises the exciting prospect that we could actually revitalize our former mining towns and turn them into centres of geothermal power production.
Here's the vision. Down at hill, former mining towns in Cornwall and the north becoming gleaming hubs of geothermal energy. Cloth-capped men proudly trooping in each morning to pour water down the well.
The bucket lines of the future.
Yeah, I'm not sure about cloth caps in Cornwall, but
they could be white lab cloth caps.
Yeah, it might not look quite like that. But you make a good point. And one of the things that I've seen working with colleagues in the UK is that the southwest and the northeast have the most promising rocks for short-term exploitation of geothermal, where there's heat fairly close to the surface. And the good news there is that both the southwest and the northeast are used to things like mining and blasting and quarrying, because they're areas which have typically had resources, be it tin or coal or limestone or whatever, removed from them. And so you talked about kind of NIMBYs earlier on. You might have a population in those places that's a little bit more supportive of a new type of exploitation of resources underneath the ground. It happens to be in places where the geothermal gradient is better. And also it happens to be in places, a couple of parts of the country, that are very good targets for leveling up and for the creation of employment. So there's almost like a perfect storm brewing there to prove the concept in those locations. And then as it's proved in those locations, it will inevitably become more economic. And, with scale, things always get cheaper. And also hopefully become more socially acceptable as people see that actually it's not that big of a deal and it's much less seismic impact than having a Taylor Swift concert happen close by.
Tom and I were there bouncing with the rest of them, trying to knock.
Part of your fault, yeah.
trying to shake the windows for 3 kilometers around.
Apparently you succeeded.
Shake It Off is in fact a geothermal anthem.
We have big thighs.
One of the things with the tin mines in Cornwall, which are empty and desolate, could they be repurposed somehow for geothermal power use?
They're not deep enough, I don't think, for
devastating
power.
news.
But I know that there have been plans looking at abandoned mines in the central belt in Scotland, like between Edinburgh and Glasgow, to pump water through and pick up heat. I think for, there's also a big use of geothermal for residential and industrial heating. You won't be surprised to hear, or hopefully you won't be surprised to hear, it's massive in the Netherlands, for example, for heating greenhouses. It's a very efficient way of producing heat. And it's such low-hanging fruit. I mean, we're mad to continue to burn natural gas in our houses to produce the heat we need when you could get it from fairly shallow under the ground.
So meters away.
Yeah, meters away. So yeah, I mean, mines go down to reasonable depth. So yeah, they're potentially. I know it's been looked at in Scotland. I don't know if that's going to be commercially successful, but yeah, potentially there's heat down there that could be used.
And returning to these mining towns, could geothermal power plants create jobs for all these cloth-capped men we talk about, or do you just put a plant there and leave it to do its thing?
So last year I was in the US and I was actually lucky enough to go to TED's Countdown conference, which is their climate conference. And they give you optional activities to do certain afternoons. And there was one that I couldn't resist, which is visiting a coal-fired power plant in Detroit, which is being decommissioned, and talking to the people there that used to work there and are doing the decommissioning. Very interesting. I mean, there were very mixed feelings in the town there because on the one hand, they saw the coal-fired power plant as a source of problems, sort of pollution, child illness, and stuff like that. On the other hand, it kept a lot of businesses going. And the great thing about existing power plants is that they already have all the grid infrastructure coming in. There's high-tension cables coming in that will take electricity away all over the country. With this particular place in Detroit, I think they were looking at using the site for battery storage so that they could leverage the high-tension cables coming in. But yeah, I mean, there have been studies, and I think the US has looked at this quite hard, taking an existing coal-fired power plant, removing it, and putting a geothermal plant in its place. That leverages the grid. It adds to the UK's clean grid supply. And also there's a lot of social benefit because it stops communities that have been dependent on these dirty power plants from being decimated by their closure and gives them a reason to continue in the same vein as before, but in a cleaner way.
And I suppose if you've got a large source of power near you, manufacturing that was previously non-viable because of its high energy requirements potentially becomes more viable, and that actually manufacturing can use this to form little hubs around these plants.
Yeah, I mean, there are going to be manufacturing processes that are still hard to decarbonize, steel production, cement and stuff like that. But generally, a lot of the engineering that we do in the UK, I'm sure that you could build geothermal plants and generate the electrical power needed to drive the manufacturing processes. So, yes.
And also, crucially, geothermal could be useful for Britain beyond the planet we live on. I was speaking to someone else who works in geothermal who's excited about the idea of using geothermal on other celestial bodies. So we get to Ganymede, for instance, and there's not as much solar energy because you're a long way from the sun, and small modular reactors might be impractical. But if there is a hot core and if there is water, as there is somewhere like Ganymede, then geothermal, of course, would be the optimal way to power the British colonial base there.
Fantastic. Yeah, I haven't actually got my ticket to go to Ganymede yet, but it's not on our business plan for the next few years. But yeah, I mean, and you don't need water. You just need a fluid that you can transport heat from downhole and to the surface. And actually, CO2 is not a bad fluid to use. So you'll pump it downhole as a liquid and it will come back and become, you can use CO2 to drive a turbine in the same way as you can use water. So you don't have to use precious water to do it. Other fluids are also available.
It certainly seems like there's some synergy between this stuff and what NASA is already doing, sending probes to like extremely hot planets.
Yeah, and actually we've been talking to NASA and working with the Jet Propulsion Laboratory in Pasadena on putting together what's called a Space Act agreement with NASA. It's still in the process of being agreed, but I think I can disclose that we've been there, we've seen what they do, and it's very, very applicable. They have challenges. I mean, a lot of their challenges are cold because deep space is cold, but they do have plans that you can see on their website to build a rover for Venus. The temperature of Venus is about 480 degrees Celsius. So by Venus standards, what we're trying to do is quite cold. So hopefully not too difficult to achieve. And there is high temperature electronic components in some of the deep space probes as well, because they use high temperatures to generate the electrical power needed.
Right. So if we crack geothermal, we have boundless power for generations. It's totally clean. It'll help us explore space. It will give us energy independence. What is a decisive thing that the government can do right now to get us there faster?
A lot of new technologies need to be kind of seeded. And sometimes they need a helping hand to begin to get to scale. And I think there's definitely a role for governments, not just the UK government, but in this specific case, absolutely the UK government to do that. There's a project in Utah in the US, which is called FORGE.
Frontier Observatory for Research in Geothermal Energy.
That is a project which is basically run by the DOE and Department of Energy in the US, drilling real wells, research into optimization of drilling techniques and drilling technologies to allow geothermal. Something like that in the UK would be brilliant because it would allow local providers of technology to have a place to try things out in a kind of quasi-real world environment and prove that the technology works. And that in itself significantly reduces the risk that, drillers of real geothermal power plants might otherwise take on new technologies. So that can kind of just provide the impetus to accelerate the development.
Where might we put this British geothermal lab?
Probably in one of the places we talked about earlier, that the southwest or the northeast would appear to be great candidates for it.
Well, Cornwall, of course, has this granite batholith, which is the bedrock, and it has decaying radioactive isotopes that generate further heat, right? This is why Cornwall is so lush.
Yeah, and for me, living in the southwest of England, Cornwall will be a great place to go. And, I can add it to the collection along with Dorset.
The UK's science hubs of Cornwall and Dorset.
Well, the global hub of geothermal, as we've been saying for years on this podcast.
Well, John, I think we will wrap up there, but maybe one final question is, what would you like the British geothermal industry to look like in 10 to 20 years? What would your ideal vision be?
I would love to see a couple of things. I'd love to see geothermal power used for heating and for power generation broadly across the United Kingdom. I mean, it's not going to take over 100%. If you look at organizations like EGEC in Europe, they recently kind of petitioned the European Parliament to look at geothermal providing about 15% of electric power by, I think it was 2040 or 2050, I can't remember which. The National Renewable Engineering Lab in the US has got similar kind of targets for the US. So if we could get to about 15% of electric power produced by geothermal in the UK, first of all, it's a sizable dent in the power sort of spectrum that we're using, if you like. And also it takes us a long way towards having that grid balancing capability that otherwise only comes from natural gas. But also, I mean, there's a whole lot of people who work in the UK who've got skills that are directly deployable in geothermal. And I think it's a great industry. The UK has the opportunity to become an exporter of technology and equipment to countries around the world to allow them to exploit their own geothermal resources. And it would be a terrible shame if we were to miss that opportunity.
And if people want to stay apprised of what you're doing or read some of your work, where should they go?
We have a newsletter on LinkedIn where we try and update not only on some of the stuff that we're doing and maybe some of the fun times that we have as well, but also we will publish what we believe are important snippets on the geothermal market, where it's going, important reports that are coming out. So certainly follow us and we'll give you content, hopefully to justify your loyalty.
And the spelling is Hephae.
That's right, Hephae. And the full company name is Hepha Energy Technology. So we added ET to the end of it for the website. So it's hepaeet.com. Or if you don't like that one, we've also got hotterisbetter.com. So hotter is better, all three words run together as one. Go to hotterisbetter.com and it will actually take you to our website.
And you've got a book as well.
Yeah, completely unrelated, actually. This was before we started Hepha. I was, like most people, sitting at home during COVID. And I'd wanted for years to get a whole load of stuff off my chest about innovation and creating value. So it's my personal download about how innovation should work and what it really means. And spoiler alert, it's not about developing technology. It's about creating stuff that people need and creating value for them, whether that's economic value or social value. And it's about how you can do that and how you can use that to make your own business successful.
And that book is called Strategy and Innovation for a Changing World. And before we wrap up, if anyone is desperate to read more about the Kohler Superdeep borehole, then you can read my essay on geothermal that was published by Works in Progress last year. And it is called What, that's WATT, great pun, What Lies Beneath.
Well,
Love it.
And with that, John, we will say goodbye and let you return to your spinning needle of a spaceship that will plummet back to Earth and several kilometers deep into the mantle back to your home base. But thank you very much for coming and talking to us. And we will...
Time for us to repair that Cotswold stone in the airlock.
Exactly. We will need to get the masonry hammers out.
John, thank you for joining us.
Thank you. Hopefully you can control the rate of plummet, but it's been a pleasure. I've really enjoyed it.
Thank you very much.